Bobo on the outside. Spunky Barn is coming on, but it's all Bridger. Bridger in the Maple Leaf Trotting Classic. He's home in 50 seconds.
Florida Jewel, the late rush. In between trotters, Kit Lobel carries crown on the far outside. A repeat performance in the Maple Leaf Trotting Classic. Lodestar Lobel finding racing room. Quarter pound on the far outside. The Maple Leaf Trotting Classic is no sex, please.
Presidential Ball wins Cup 10 for Ron Waples.
Hi everyone, Rachel Onema here with Trot Magazine, and today we're in lovely Baden, Ontario for a special Ask Me Anything interview with the legendary Ron Waples. Ronnie, thank you so much for having us in your home and for doing this interview.
Thank you, it's my pleasure.
Our first question is from Garnet from North York, who asks, who was the toughest driver to drive against locally and at the Meadowlands, and why?
Well, there are two different places, the Meadowlands and here. I think when I was getting started up here, probably the toughest for me, especially on a half-mile track, was Bud Fritz. Mm-hmm. And on the big track, maybe Bill Wellwood. Okay. Got the utmost admiration and respect for both horsemen, but that's just the way I found them.
Yeah.
And then when I went to Meadowlands, it was probably, I don't know, maybe Mike LaChance and Cantello Manzi. And same thing, I got the utmost respect for both of them. They're great drivers, great horsemen. It's just the way I found it when I went there.
Do you ever keep in touch with any of those drivers now?
Yeah, pretty well them all. You see them. I just came back from the Hall of Fame in Goshen, New York, and seen a bunch of them down there. Mike was there, Catello wasn't there, but you see a lot of them at different functions like that, and which is nice and good.
Yeah. So our next question is from Mario from Toronto, and his question is, during your days at the OJC, which we found out that is the Ontario Jockey Club, was there a driver, in your opinion, that could have had the success you did when you made the move to the Meadowlands but chose to stay local?
Well, I think if you took the top 5 drivers at that time, if you took any one of them down there, I'm sure they would have succeeded. You know, I mean, there's such a fine line between the top driver and the 5th top driver or the 10th top driver. It usually comes down to who's got the best horse.
Yeah, absolutely. So Mark from St. Mary's asked, who was the best driver you drove with and the best trainer you drove for?
That's kind of a tough question. You know, I drove horses for a lot of good trainers. You know, I'd have to mention Bill Robinson for one. I drove a lot of good horses for him. I'd have to mention Stu Ferlat because he trained Ralph Hanover for me. And I'd go back to a fellow named J. Russell Miller that probably nobody even heard of nowadays, but he only bought a few Colts every year, and he came up with a champion almost every year. He was a great trainer.
So our next question, Bruce from Durham asks, who was your biggest influence in your career as a driver?
When I started out, I think I'd have to say Keith Waples and Hervé Filion, because they were doing the winning then, and yeah, I would have to say both of them. I kind of, not that I modeled myself after them per se, because they were in a league of their own, but I kind of watch what they do and hope that I could repeat that someday.
Yeah. So Mark from Woodstock asks 2 questions. Who are the 5 greatest drivers in the history of our sport? And his other question is, who are the 5 greatest Canadian drivers in the history of our sport?
I have a different opinion of this here, what Mark wants to know there. I guess the best way for me to describe it is I don't think you can take a driver from this era and match him against a driver from 30 years ago, or let's say 50 years ago, because everything is different. And I don't think it's fair to the drivers of yesteryear, and I don't think it's fair to the drivers now. There's just a pile of good drivers up here, and in saying that, I think Woodbine Entertainment's probably got the strongest driver colony of any place in the world, really.
Awesome. So Jack from Cambridge asks, back in your heyday of driving, how did all the elite drivers get along? Was there any interesting rivalries or clashes between any of them? And do you have any particular rivalries or conflicts at any point that you can talk about?
No, not really. You know, the drivers is a thing. Everybody would say, you know, what are you talking about on the racetrack and everything like that. It was usually a hockey game, a girl we seen in a movie, was dressed or undressed, or stuff like that, important stuff. But when you're off the track, you're become best of friends, some of us, you know. And then once you get on the track and get in behind the gate, and then the gate says go, you got no friends.
Right.
You're sent out there to do a job, and you best do it the best of your ability.
Did you ever find that there was any time when it was difficult to set that boundary of friends on and off the track?
No, like I say, once you go in behind the gate, it's a different ball game. You know, you just you're zeroed in on that gate and who's leaving, who's not leaving, and how you got to race your horse. You don't look for friendship out there.
So Deb from Burlington asks, is it true that you once fired all the help for not showing up on time?
That would be no. Then I would have had to do all the work myself. I might be foolish, but not stupid.
So Murray from Pensacola, Florida asks the question, when I compare today's drivers, I see even the great ones lose races by not measuring their competition. I witnessed you outdrive better horses by boxing them in behind you and only going as fast as you needed to win. Sometimes hooking wheels when a horse tried to get past you on the wood. Why don't today's drivers utilize this technique?
Well, to start with, hooking wheels is illegal, so if I did that, it was by accident, not by intention, because it's illegal. You'd get fined or set back, or fined and set back both. I think the best way for me to describe that is that nowadays it seems to be a power drive that they're given. To me, it seemed to be a little bit more finesse back in the day when I started. Not on my part, maybe, but I think all the drivers then, there's a little bit more finesse. Now it seems to me like it's who's got the most power is going to get the job done.
Do you find that because of the enforced whipping rules, for example, do you think, in your opinion as a driver, that makes an impact on how much you do or don't drive a horse?
No, I don't think so. It's just a different era we live in now, and a lot of times what a fan sees is not really reality. That's just a fan's perception of what they see. I think the whipping rule is a great thing. I think it is, and I think if you asked 9.5 out of 10 drivers, are all going to agree with me on that. I think where we kind of went by the wayside a little, I believe the regulatory body, like the judges, should have maybe been a little bit stricter on it, maybe a few years ago, and then we wouldn't have been going through this now, I guess.
Right. So our next question is from John from Surrey, BC, and he has submitted the following. Hi Ron, it has been many, many years. You may remember me as Len Figman's son. He was not really my father, but he and my mom were together throughout the 70s and the 80s. I was the one who trained Stony Bay when Dave Green had him. As a kid, you were my biggest hero. I always remembered your great skills and the nickname guys had for you. The kid with the golden gloves. Anyways, my question, when did you decide to retire from driving and what made you make the decision?
Well, about 6 years ago I decided to stop then, and I think my age had something to do with it. It's a young man's game, that's just the way it is, and that's the way it'll always be.
Yeah. Our next question is from Bill from Guelph, Ontario, and he asks the question, when you moved back to Canada, you told me that Frank Salive, the then race announcer at Woodbine Entertainment, was calling you the Great One. I thought that you misinterpreted him, for he was actually saying the Grey One. Can you clarify this, please?
Well, it sounds like a question Bill O'Donnell would ask, but whether it is or whether it isn't, definitely the Grey One would suit me better than the Great One.
Our next question is from Andy from Red Deer and Grant from Nova Scotia, and they asked a similar question, that if you currently owned or trained a high-priced 2-year-old colt ready to race on the Grand Circuit, who would be your preference to sit in the sulky? But before you answer that, how many horses do you own now, and tell us a bit about them?
Well, for the driver of the high-classed horse, that's easy. I put myself down first and Randy second. Randy might disagree with that, but I've got the mic here. We have, got to stop and think here for a minute. We bought 3 2-year-olds or yearlings last fall. 2 of the 3 are racing now, and we got 1 3-year-old that is racing now. And we have 1 yearling to sell this fall, and we have a broodmare that just dropped a foal, and she's back in foal. So that's the extent of our stable right now.
Awesome. Our next question is from Jim from Sudbury, and he wonders, do you think harness racing suffers from the lack of opportunities for young, skilled drivers to break into the Woodbine Mohawk fraternity? It seems to me like Mohawk has become a good old boys mentality, where who you know can just be as important as actual talent, and the familiarity of the drivers with each other leads to less competitive racing because the drivers seem reluctant to park others or force the pace.
Well, I don't know. It seems like when I started out, you had to work really hard, and what's very important, I think, for young people is to be nice to people, because those people are putting you down to drive. I don't think it's any tougher nowadays than it was in those days. You need a break somewhere along the line, and if you keep working hard, there's a good chance you're going to get that break.
Jim from Toronto asks the question, my understanding is drivers do not get paid if they don't finish in the top 5. That is pretty bad for taking your life in the other driver's hands. I think they should get $25 to $50 each drive. Your thoughts?
Where was Jim 30 years ago? You know, I could have used him then. It's too late for me, but I agree with Jim. I think if you work, you should get paid no matter what you do, you know. But I understand with the expenses being so high on racehorses now and supporting them, but I think if you work, you should get paid.
So Ronnie from Nova Scotia asks, what are your thoughts on the urging rules for today's driver?
Well, there again, we kind of half answered that question a while ago. I think it's the perception of what the fan sees is not necessarily reality. You know, I think the whipping rule, the urging rule, call it whatever you want, I think is very essential. I guess I wish that a few years ago the commissioner of the regulatory board then would have stepped in and had some stiffer fines or whatever else. And maybe we wouldn't be going through this now.
Right. Bob from Smith Falls asks for your best memory of Cowboy Russ Kernan.
Cowboy Ross Kernan, he was a good driver, a great driver, you could say, a good horseman. He was hard on himself in his life, I guess, but he was a very good horseman.
So Maurice from Laval, Quebec asks, do you remember Gilles Lachance at Richelieu Park? Tell me a few words about him.
Well, he was very successful in his era back then, and one thing I did know, the fans just doted on him. They thought the world of him, and he was a very successful driver.
Our next question comes from Dave from Ennismore, and he asks, of all the owners you had in your great career, who was the most quirky? Was it maybe John Bosworth or the War Stable?
Well, the War Stable, that was me and 2 partners, and they were the greatest partners in the world, so it definitely wasn't them. But it comes to mind to me, I had a fellow out of New York, John Comfort was his name, and he was a very fair guy and very good to me, but you could say he was a bit quirky.
So Carl from Kitchener asks, do you think that the rules regarding the fair start pole need addressing? In my opinion, it's absurd to think that a horse traveling behind the field and barely making it to the pole has any chances of being competitive.
Well, I don't know how to answer that really. I'd be open to any suggestions, though. It is the best we got right now, you know, and if somebody comes up with a better suggestion, then maybe we should do it.
Next question comes from Baco from Vancouver, and they ask, considering the horse's health and potential long-term development, what is your opinion on the strategy of allowing our 2-year-old to develop and grow into himself before racing at 3?
Well, I think there's some 2-year-olds been better off if they were still out in the field, you know, but there again, we're getting back to the cost of owning horses and that, and you gotta, you know, make money when you can with them, you know, and maybe some of them would be better off out, and maybe some you turn them out, come back, they go the same speed as a 3-year-old.
So Danny from Ontario asks, if you have a 2-year-old who seems to be underperforming to expectations, would it be prudent to castrate the horse? Would that have an attitude-changing moment on the horse, or would he care less? And would that recovery time on a horse that has already been trained out? Would you give up on the 2-year-old that showed promise during qualifiers and training? This horse has a bit of an attitude to begin with. I am new to this industry and a sponge when it comes to trying to be informed.
Well, I can relate to that sponge part. I still am. I like to learn different things. I never hesitated on castrating a 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old. I just think some of them that are don't really want to put out, or you don't think they want to put out, and you geld them, they come to be a different horse.
Our next question comes from Alex from Charlottetown, and they ask the following. What would you do to get a horse to stop hitting his left front sesamoid?
Well, that's a tough thing to overcome. Pacers get doing that. And, you know, my way of thinking, if a horse interferes, you either got to get the front end out of the way quicker, or you got to slow the back end up, and sometimes you get to slowing the back end up with shoeing and whatever else, you start to get a little soreness. I'm presuming this is a pacer he has, and I'm thinking the first thing probably I would do is put a little set of light half-round shoes on him in front, lets him break over quicker, and also square his toes off to the left side and on the left foot and the right side of the right foot, and that lets him break over quicker. It's a tough spot to get them away from, really.
Right. So Steve from Rockwood asks, what should the sport do about these beard trainers? Do you think this is an issue?
I definitely think it's an issue. I definitely don't like it. I just think it does nothing but harm. It's not something that just started. It has been in the industry for a while. I think now they're just starting to act on it. You know, there again, the regulatory body's got to step in sometime and say this isn't right.
The next question comes from John from Rivervale, New Jersey, and he wonders if you can tell us about a time a fellow driver picked you up hitchhiking on the way to Garden City Racetrack.
That's John Campbell's claim to fame. You know, not all the big races he's won, all that stuff he's raced. That's his claim to fame. My car was broke down. John Campbell never had an issue about getting up in the morning because he didn't get up in the morning. But I'm walking down the road to go to Garden City, and who comes along but John Campbell? I said, John, I appreciate the ride, but you're the last guy I wanted to see right now. That's his claim to fame, I think.
Is John Campbell somebody that you stay in touch with at all?
Oh yeah, we see him quite often, and sometimes I give him a call or he gives me a call. He's I've known him since he was probably about 10, 12 years old, so no reason not to talk to him now.
Yeah. Now we're also told that you owe Paula Campbell a fancy dinner that you haven't made good on. Is that true?
Well, a couple times I made good on it when racetracks were picking up the tab for the dinner, and I said, now this is my treat here now tonight, but she don't seem to want to accept that. And it is true, I owe her a meal.
All right, folks, this concludes our part 1 of Ask Me Anything with the legendary Ronnie Waples. Tune in tomorrow for part 2.